Good afternoon, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. Welcome to everyone, and a special welcome to our guest tonight, Ambassador Dennis Ross of the Washington Institute and the always great Warren Olney. Thank you both for joining us tonight. America at a Crossroads is a joint venture between Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. Thanks to our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine, Zev Yaroslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chase, and Caroline Kelly, David Lair, and myself. We are all volunteers, and we really appreciate your donations. They all are going to directly offset our costs. As an aside, I really do want to express all of our gratitude for how supportive our audience has been to enable this program to continue. A couple of little announcements. The two most often asked questions. One, where is my Zoom link? I want you all to know we do send it 5 times. By the way, the rest of you are sending me notes that we send it too many times, but we do send it exactly 5 times in the 24 hours before each program. But if you're not getting it, it means it's either in your spam, you blocked us, you unsubscribed from our email list, or you unchecked the box when you registered that indicated that you don't want to receive emails from us, which means you won't receive emails from us. So I would suggest you pay really careful attention to those functions on your computer. Number 2 question, how do I watch any of our programs after the fact? All 120 of our programs are on both the Judge website and the CAI website within a few hours after their completion. They all stay there indefinitely. We also have a YouTube channel called America at a Crossroads. So, and there's a link in every email we send. So they're really easy to find, and they're really wonderful programs, as you all know, those of you who are here. If you haven't seen them before, be sure to go check out the YouTube station. Next week, Senate Homeland Security Committee Chairperson, Senator Gary Peters, will be in conversation with Pat Morrison. Senator Peters will surely give us his uniquely informed view of the current state of domestic terrorism and thoughts about the threats being posed against our country. The following week, we welcome Kathleen Ballou, who is a tenured professor of history at Northwestern University, and I believe she's also at University of Chicago. She's an international authority on the White Power movement. She is an author of Bring the War Home, the White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, and she also co-wrote a field guide to white supremacy. She will be in conversation with KCRW's Madeline Brand, discussing Have Extremism and Bigotry Gone Mainstream? Are Texas and Florida setting a path? So those next 2 weeks programs will be really connected, and they should offer really great information to all of us for a current view of domestic extremism. Now, my great friend and America Crossroads partner, David Lair, will complete the introductions tonight. David?
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Janice. Tonight, we'll tackle a headline-making topic that reverberates throughout the world and has profound implications for us and our future, the war between Ukraine and Russia. Our guest is extraordinarily well qualified to not only discuss the war, but also the ripple effects of what happens in that region of the world and in other seemingly far afield areas. Following on the programs that Janice just mentioned, in 3 weeks, we welcome back David Gergen, advisor to 4 presidents and a pundit extraordinaire. His is a familiar face to most Americans, if not because he stood beside so many commanders in chief, but also because of his years as a commentator on the PBS NewsHour and now with CNN. His observations are always valuable. David will be in conversation with tonight's host, Warren Olney. The following week, August 24th, we welcome back Bill Kristol, a man who's been described as the intellectual Brahmin of the modern conservative movement. He'll be in conversation with Sarah Longwell, the publisher of The Bulwark, a leading voice of anti-Trump Republicans, and their topic is Swing Voters, Where Does the Balance of Power Lie? You'll see our future programs on the screen at the end of tonight's discussion, and you'll receive emails notifying you of all these programs and providing you the opportunity to sign up. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Mel Levine, a decades-long friend and a founding member of the JUDJ Executive Committee. He's a former congressman and has been a tremendous help in securing the speakers that we have heard from over the past 2 years. Mel?
Thanks very much, David. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce Ambassador Dennis Ross as our speaker this evening. Anybody who's followed Middle East peace efforts in the past 35 or 40 years will know that one of the key architects of US policy has been Dennis Ross. I had the great pleasure of working very closely with Dennis, both as a member of Congress, and he managed to drag me back into a variety of these peace efforts for almost a decade after I left Congress. And I was constantly impressed by Dennis's creativity and commitment. And frankly, I think we all owe him an incredible debt of thanks for the many years he's put into these extraordinarily important efforts. While he is best known for these efforts in the Middle East, tonight we are going to rely on him for another area of his expertise, which is Russia. Going back a few decades, Dennis wrote his doctoral thesis on Soviet decision-making, and well after that, he served in the State Department's Policy Planning Department, where he played a very prominent role with regard to US policy pertaining to Russia. We are calling on that expertise for the bulk of his discussion this evening. We're also really happy that Warren Olney is once again going to moderate this presentation. Warren is, as our audience well knows, a much awarded and honored broadcast journalist. He is a superb moderator, and his interviewing skills are incomparable. I've just lost my screen. I don't know if that means you've lost me, but I hope that as I think I'm lateraling this to Warren, I'm still being heard. Warren?
Mel, thank you very much. I have the lateral and I can still see you, so I don't think anything has gone wrong, except on a very localized basis. So, Mr. Ambassador, I'm just delighted to be able to talk with you. It's been a long time since we have talked, but we've talked many times, and it's wonderful to have an opportunity to talk with you again.
My pleasure to be with you. We go back a long time.
A long time, a long time. I want to just say too to the audience, welcome to you, and you can send your questions by email to David Lehrer, who will then transmit them to me, and after we've talked for a half hour or so, and I've been asking the questions, I will transmit your questions to Ambassador Ross as long as I possibly can. So, once again, calling on your history, both as a doctoral student, and then I want to make the point that when you were director of the policy planning office in the State Department,
Right.
that was in the first presidency of George W. Bush, and it was also in the first elected presidency of Vladimir Putin. And I'm interested to know, does the special military operation in Ukraine, is it consistent with your impressions of Putin from the outset, or has he radically changed?
Interesting question. Just to correct one thing, I worked for George H.W. Bush, not for George W. Bush.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought you did. Okay.
It's all right, but it's
Yeah.
and so I was there for the collapse of the Soviet Union.
I was going to say, all right, good.
And obviously I was there for Gorbachev, and I was in along with Jim Baker. I was in meetings where there was just four of us in those meetings. So I saw what was, in a sense, the transformation of the Soviet Union. I saw Yeltsin come on, and then I did meet Putin in the year 2000. At the time, I was actually our negotiator in the Middle East, and the Russians were hosting a multilateral working groups as part of the Middle East, what was launched originally during the Madrid process, and then was something that was maintained for a while, fell apart, and then was resumed after Ehud Barak became the prime minister in Israel in 1999. So I did meet Putin in 2000. He had not been in power for a long time. I would say Putin of those years was interested in trying to convey an image of having a relationship, being a partner with the United States. Obviously, he did think, if you go back to Chechnya, his scorched earth approach to Chechnya, in a sense, previewed what we've seen in Syria, and now what we've seen also in Ukraine. So that element of Putin was clearly present, But what was different then is that he was trying to restore Russia to a certain standing internationally, cooperating with the United States, having a relationship with the United States was part of a strategy at that time to demonstrate that Russia was working with the US and was in a sense on par again, had not lost its superpower standing. Being able to be seen as negotiating with the United States, working with the United States, for Putin in the early years, there's no question, this was part and parcel of a strategy to reestablish what had been lost. You know, this is someone who said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. This wasn't even the worst tragedy within Russia itself during the 20th century. Obviously, what it experienced in World War II, the purges and so forth. But why he presented it that way? Because Russia lost its status, it lost its stature. If a country can go through a post-traumatic stress syndrome, Russia did. In the 1990s, the economy collapsed. It was seen as a country that had no real place. The law and order completely broke down. He is someone who gained credence domestically because he reestablished order on the inside, and gradually he seemed to create Russia with a presence on the outside. So this is part and parcel of who he was. I would say there has been a change. I think part of the change reflects he felt a need to wreak vengeance for what he believed was America exploiting Russian weakness in the 1990s. He reads, and you see it again in the run up to Ukraine, he saw the expansion of NATO as an effort to exploit Russian weakness, not just to, in a sense, bring NATO forces closer to Russia, but to exploit Russia at a time when it was clearly quite weak economically, weak militarily. And he saw, I think for a long time, he aimed to try to produce some kind of reaction to this, to get back at us. You go back to his speech in Munich in 2006, he previews a lot of what comes after that in terms of saying we cannot have a unipolar world. That's a threat. His reaction to all the color revolutions he saw as a threat to him domestically. All these things kind of came together. But I would just say the one point of continuity, go back to Chechnya. At the end of 1999, 2000, absolutely a scorched earth approach. No limits recognized, destroying cities without any limitations whatsoever. We saw that, we saw that movie before, we've seen the sequel now.
War crimes have been part of the program since the beginning.
He's not felt that there are any targets that are unacceptable. And if you think about it, it's part of a strategy. Why? Because when he engages in these kinds of onslaughts on cities, it has a terror impact. His aim is to demonstrate that there are no limits on him, that no one can stop him from doing this, that those that he's attacking are powerless to prevent it. He wants to depopulate these areas. That's clearly been part of the strategy everywhere. Going back to Grozny, then you see it in Aleppo, and you've seen it clearly throughout Ukraine as well. The fact that he targets cities, it's not a mistake, it's by design.
What is the design for? What is it supposed to accomplish, particularly depopulation?
I think the aim is depopulate, terrorize, depopulate, create a sense of powerlessness in the face of what he's doing, produce what is a win. He's not worrying about the reconstruction. He's focused on winning the way he defines winning, which is to show that you couldn't stop him.
So depopulation isn't a diplomatic strategy of some kind. He doesn't gain something in that respect by cutting down the population. You're just saying it's a tool of terror.
Absolutely. It is a tool of terror. And look, by the way, if these are people who he thinks are going to resist Russia, then it is part of the strategy. Force them to leave. That's not, again, this is not by accident with him. This is part of a calculation. And it's hard to exaggerate. He lives in a world of power, and how does he communicate that power that he can't be resisted? think about it. When he can do that on the outside, it also sends a message on the inside. He will impose power. We're seeing it. You can't, there's no dissent. And the slightest dissent, you have a 15-year prison term. If the world can't stop him on the outside, no one's going to stop him on the inside.
You mentioned the weakness of the Soviet Union and of Russia in the 90s. Excuse me, it was Russia, of course, by then. President Obama talked about a reset with Russia, but he was also he made light of Putin, it seems to me, and of Russia itself. And I wonder if he, by doing that, contributed to Putin's feelings of the need for vengeance against the United States.
I think a lot of things affected him in terms of his particular perception of President Obama. One was that he saw that the president was in favor of a reset, and he defined the reset in terms of arms control. It wasn't a broad reset of overall relations. It was more a sense of, look, you're a nuclear power, we're a nuclear power. We should pursue arms control. That's kind of been lost. Obama comes in after Bush. Bush actually has a relationship with Putin. You recall, he has a meeting with him where he says he looked into his eyes and he saw his soul. So there was a relationship there, but the last couple of years, Putin goes into Georgia. Again, he previews what we're seeing today. He recognizes two breakaway republics. He goes in. By the way, the military performance wasn't stellar then either, but the numbers couldn't be resisted. They don't recognize an international border. They reimpose one. So a lot of what we've seen takes place then. There's a minimal reaction on the part of the West. In a lot of ways, Putin, if you look at Putin, Putin is not this huge risk taker. He's very careful how he does things. When he goes into Crimea, recall how he does it. He does it with little green men. I mean, not literally little green men, but these are Russian military who have no identifying insignias. Now, he does this because he's not sure what our reaction is going to be. If it turns out to be a very tough reaction, he has complete deniability. But it turns out not to be a very tough reaction. Then he goes into Eastern Ukraine as well. And for a long period of time, he denies there's any Russian soldiers there. Eventually, he says, oh, yeah, they went there, but they went there on holiday. Because we know most people like to take their vacation in war zones. I mean, this is a guy who basically, he tests the waters. He does the same thing when he goes into Syria in 2015. Again, he goes in stealthily. He doesn't know what the reaction is going to be. When he finds that there's not really going to be a reaction, he becomes much emboldened. And so there's a pattern here in terms of his behavior. I don't view him as someone who is suicidal. I don't view him as someone who takes risks that he thinks are excessive. Doesn't mean he can't miscalculate. But I also think if you look at the behavior so far in Ukraine, lots of threats about what he'll do, that we won't recognize the nature of what he could do. And yet here you have all these NATO countries that are participating. He doesn't strike across NATO borders. He could intercept a lot of the weapons that are coming in, but he doesn't try to intercept them. He doesn't try to interdict them outside of Ukraine's borders. So he stays even here within certain bounds. We need to be mindful of that in terms of the kinds of risks he's prepared to run. He will, he's prepared to make big threats. But we have to look again at the legacy of how he acts in those threats. He's much more likely to become a big risk taker when he thinks that there's actually no risk to take.
I've heard it said that he can't afford to lose in Ukraine, and that consequently his threat to use nuclear weapons is something that we really should take very seriously. You're suggesting that it might not be as strong a threat as we're fearful of?
Look, I don't think you ever dismiss someone who makes nuclear threats, because when you do contingency planning, you don't do it on likelihood, you do it on severity of consequence. So even if there's a 10% chance, you have to take that into account.
Yeah.
But I would simply say, look at the behavior. There's a track record here, even now. We are shipping in weapons that actually impose a high cost on them. We've sent these HIMARS, which are really kind of multiple rocket launchers. We have sought to limit the threat they pose to the Russians by only providing those that have about a 40-mile range. We could provide them that have a 3 to 4 time range, as opposed to the ones that we provided. But we don't want the Ukrainians hitting into Russia. So we've been very careful. But they've imposed, you hear the Ukrainians say, the impact they're having in terms of being able to hit beyond the front lines, take out weapons depots, take out some of the big weapons, take out ammunition dumps. So the kind of intensity of artillery fire they were taking has been reduced in the last week to 10 days. I'm not saying it's disappeared, but they themselves are saying they're losing. I've seen that Zelensky said, look, we were losing 200 a day. Now we're losing about 30 a day. So they're having a big impact, and it's not changing the character of what Putin does. My point is that I think we should be mindful of some of his threats, but I also think that we shouldn't take all of them literally. And here again, we can test some of the limits ourselves. We can be, I think, a bit more forthcoming in terms of the weapons we provide them and how quickly we provide them.
How much more do you think we should give them?
It's pretty clear to me that there are a range of different kinds of long-range artillery and these kind of multiple rocket launchers. We could do more than we're doing. Now, to be fair, there are limitations in terms of what we have in our own stockpile.
Yeah.
So that kind of limits what we can do, unless, of course, I mean, look, our military is going to insist on replacing everything that we've sent them. But I would say, if you want to change Putin's calculus so that Putin begins to look for a way out, he has to see that the price is simply too high. At this point, he thinks he's going to win in a war of attrition. He thinks he can outlast the Ukrainians. He thinks he's manipulating the gas supply. We're already seeing it once again this week. He thinks that's going to force the Europeans, as they anticipate winter coming on, that they're not going to be able to sustain support for Ukraine in these circumstances, and he believes he will win a war of attrition. Now, I'm not saying this is a calculation that looks so misguided, but I am suggesting that if it becomes clear that the cost is going to continue to go up, that he can't subdue the Ukrainians, that the Europeans are going to continue to provide support, that what he's done, he's crossed a line. In a lot of ways he has. I mean, look at Germany. Germany has tripled its defense spending. It's providing weapons to the Ukrainians. It changed its posture in 1 week's time because of what he did. Europe, which was always preoccupied with its commercial interests, has suddenly seen the nature of the security threat and has reacted. So his counting on the fact that they're going to grow weary, that they'll be more worried about getting cold during the winter than they will be about supporting the Ukrainians, it could be right. But so far, if you look at how many times Putin in this conflict has miscalculated, his track record on miscalculation seems rather high at this point.
So what if he's right and the Europeans back down and they don't provide the resources that are necessary to at least make it too expensive for Putin, if that's the right phrase to use? Yeah. What happens then?
Look, what does he want? We heard this week from his foreign minister in Cairo, they're back to having to replacing Zelensky. They were denying that for a while. They're saying no. And his Lavrov in Cairo in meeting with a number of Arab countries, foreign ministers, he was very clear. The regime has to go. So if you ask me, what does he want? He wants to demonstrate he won. Now, for a while, his demonstration that he won is that he takes the whole Donbass area of eastern Ukraine. It looks to me like right now he's upping the ante of what constitutes what he wants, and that is to wear the Ukrainians down to the point where Zelensky doesn't remain in power. that becomes a symbol of his win. Now, if the Europeans grow weary, if we grow weary, you can bet that's what he's going to try to do. Now, he may find in the next 2 months that the hollowness of his forces and the high morale of the Ukrainians, they seem to be much more effective militarily, certainly in direct combat, than the Russians are. Their morale is dramatically higher, and they look to be preparing a counteroffensive to take back the Kherson area, which was one of the areas that was first lost. Now, if it looks like they can begin to do that, Putin again probably has to recalculate. Look, I've seen statistics that suggest that between dead and wounded, 60,000 dead and wounded on the Russian side. That's a colossal number. That's a colossal number. And he can't keep that number hidden forever. He's certainly trying to hide it. But you can't keep it hidden from the families. So as much as he has a kind of timetable to outlast Zelensky and the Europeans, he has to worry a little bit himself about what's going to be the blowback from the Russian public. Yes, they're under control. For sure, they're under control for now. But he's not indifferent to the public. Many have asked the question, why hasn't he mobilized much larger forces? He went in with forces that were much too small, partly because, again, a miscalculation. He thought his army was strong. He thought the Ukrainians weren't a real country. He thought they wouldn't resist. He thought they would win within 2 or 3 days. All that turned out to be wrong. What happens if they begin to lose? They have some big setbacks. And at what point can he no longer keep the number of fatalities and casualties hidden? I mean, I don't think that he has, he can try to present this as being very confident and he can win a war of attrition. There's a cost on his side too. By the way, the economic cost will go up. Yes, he has sustained things in a way that has created at least a kind of baseline that has allowed the day-to-day existence of most Russians not to become dramatically worse than it was. But these sanctions will become more effective over time. So a combination of the losses and what may be the economic price within these are the kind of things that can come up and eventually limit what he can do. So I am of the view that he doesn't have forever. There's a time limit on his side as well.
Recently, you mentioned the comments by the Foreign Minister Lavrov. I think in that same recent commentary, didn't he repeat the idea that there's Nazism in Ukraine? And if you're zooming in on Zelensky, who of course is Jewish, that seems to me a very hard argument to make. Does it really go very far?
Well, certainly he's tried it from the beginning, even before they went.
Yeah.
And it tends to work within Russia because they completely control the media. I would say, anyone who lives outside the cities in Russia, anyone who's probably over the age of 50, they get their news almost entirely from state media. Now, the people who are younger, people who live in the cities, they may be much more aware. They have alternatives through social media, notwithstanding all the firewalls that the Russians have tried to create on them. But there's also been a brain drain. A lot of younger people have left. I mean, the longer term costs for Russia of this conflict, they're very hard to exaggerate at this point. They're going to be very high.
There's an organization called the Jewish Agency, which, as I understand it, has had a lot to do with making it possible for Jews to leave Russia and go to Israel. There's a threat, as I understand it, I don't believe it's been done yet, but a threat to close the Moscow office of the Jewish Agency. What would be the consequences of that, and why do they do it?
So, two good questions. It's actually beyond the Moscow office. They're talking about closing down the Jewish Agency in Russia. That's what was being discussed. Why? Because they said that the Jewish Agency was breaking Russian law, that they weren't being transparent. Now, again, this is kind of it's a phony argument. The Jewish Agency hasn't changed anything it's been doing, the way it's operated. What does it do? It facilitates Jewish immigration to Israel, Aliyah. It engages in Jewish education. It supports Jewish cultural events in Russia. This is something, by the way, that Putin has always tolerated. Putin has had a very interesting relationship with the Jewish population within Russia. You go back and Putin talks about when he was growing up, he had a Jewish neighbor who lived down the hall. And this, he had favorable views of the Jews as a result of that. And he's had a relationship with Israel as well. He tends to view you have more than 1 million Russians who live, people who, Russian descent, of more recent vintage, who live in Israel. And he's tended to view them still as Russian citizens, so much so that they're entitled to get pensions, even though they're living there. In fact, the issue of sanctions became a potential problem for the Israelis who get pensions from Russia because of the sanctions. So this relationship has been kind of a vibrant one. All of a sudden, there's a threat to close them down. Tomorrow, there is a court that will hear the appeal from the Jewish Agency. Israel is sending a delegation to be there for that. Initially, they were having a hard time getting visas, but then those were granted. Some of the harsh language that was being used on the Russian side has been tempered in the last day. So what's going on? I think what's going on is, you have a new prime minister, Lapid. When in the Bennett-Lapid government, there was a kind of good cop, bad cop vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. Bennett was very careful not to be critical of the Russians. He maintained an open line with Putin. He even went and saw Putin as part of a mediation effort about a month into the conflict. In the meantime, Lapid, the foreign minister, adopted a very tough posture publicly, referred to war crimes. So my sense of what's going on is the Russians have decided, Putin has decided, to send a message to the Israelis. We can affect things that really matter to you if you do things that make us unhappy as it relates to Ukraine. And I think the message has been sent. Lapid made a pretty tough statement initially in response that there'd be consequences for the relationship, but he sort of tempered his public language now. The Russians seem to have tempered their language. President Herzog of Israel has been brought into the effort to mediate with the Russians. I suspect that we're going to see Putin continue to try to manipulate those things that put pressure on the Israelis. Another example of this, the Israelis have carried out, by my count, between over 1,500 attacks into Syria to blunt Hezbollah trying to embed itself along in the Golan, but also Iran is engaging in what I call a precision-guided project. They are trying to put precision guidance on the missiles that they have given to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles and rockets and projectiles. Not all of them have range or payload capabilities that it would be worth putting precision guidance on, but you're talking about 75,000 to 80 rockets or missiles that if they had precision guidance, they could completely overwhelm Israel's missile defense network. And the reason the Israelis keep carrying out these attacks is to blunt the provision of those capabilities to Hezbollah. And the Russians did actually at one point, the Russians have had a significant military presence there since they intervened in 2015. They have built up a very significant missile defense capability. They have S-300s there, S-400s there. If they turn those on, if they train those radars and locked onto Israeli aircraft, this would change entirely the equation and raise the cost to the Israelis of continuing to operate. In the last week, they became much tougher in criticism of Israel for a number of recent attacks that were carried out within Syria, part and parcel of the message sending, along with the Jewish Agency. Now, what's interesting is they didn't, at this point, they haven't denied the Israelis their ability, their freedom of action so far, freedom of operation. But they're signaling that they could. A few weeks ago, they actually did fire some rockets of their own, but it was done after the Israeli planes departed. Again, sending a signal. And all of that was taking place after the handover from Naftali Bennett to Yair Lapid as prime minister within Israel.
One suggestion I've seen is that another reason is that Putin's worried about a brain drain.
It's an interesting argument. The number of Russians who have left to make Aliyah since February is 3 times what it was last year, and is actually greater than the number of Ukrainians, Jews from Ukraine, who have emigrated to Israel. So I don't dismiss that as a possibility. I don't know that it's the most important factor, but I don't dismiss it as a possibility. I think the main factor is still he doesn't want Israel somehow transforming itself into completely supporting the United States against the Russians in Ukraine. What Israel doesn't have a lot of trade with Russia, but it has not also imposed sanctions either. Now, it has to be mindful of engaging with Russian entities that if they did, and those entities like Russian banks are under sanction, then whoever engages with them is also subject to secondary sanctions. So Israel's being very careful, observing not doing business with anyone that would subject them to sanctions, but not having imposed sanctions themselves.
I want to get to the listener questions. Before I do, let me ask you this. President Biden has taken an enormous amount of heat for the fist bump with the prince in Saudi Arabia, and it's related to the war in Ukraine in the sense that it's argued that what he really wants is to get to Saudi Arabia to deal with oil and deal with that issue. What about it? And you know, Adam Schiff and others are saying that this is just another example. I think a picture's worth 1,000 words is what Adam Schiff said, and to show America's reliance on oil dictators around the world. And others are saying things that are equally critical of their own president, Joe Biden. What about it?
So I want to put it in some perspective by making 2 different kinds of comments. One comment is just to say Biden went not only because of oil in the near term. We're involved in a long-term competition now with Russia and China. And China has supported the Russians. The two come together because they see that they can try to prevent the United States from continuing to dominate what we call a rules-based international system. They would like to change the rules so that they can have spheres of influence where they can dictate to all of the nations in that sphere, not only what they do on the outside, but what they do on the inside. If they want to change borders through force, they can do that. If they want to have no potential interference in anything that they do domestically. They don't want human rights to be part of anything that happens internationally. So Biden understands we're in a longer term competition. You need the resources of Saudi Arabia to be part of a larger coalition over time. We have an interest in having democracies be part of a coalition, but we also have an interest in states that are not democracies, but are not revisionist states, meaning they don't want to revise the international order. They don't want to revise the regional order. Iran is a revisionist state in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is not. So what you have with President Biden is he's looking at this longer term competition. Now, oil is a part of it, but it's not only a part of it for right now. We need to transition away from fossil fuels. It's going to take us 20 to 25 years to do that. We don't want to be lurching, every 6 months to a year from $3 or $4 a gallon to $6 or $7 a gallon. So having some understandings with the Saudis now, having some understandings with the Saudis about how you transition to renewables. In his trip, one of the big things that people didn't notice, we worked out a set of understandings with the Saudis to invest together in a major way in green hydrogen, something that the Saudis are doing big time. We're going to collaborate in technologies related to carbon capture and carbon sequestration. So this is actually something that's in our longer term interest in terms of transitioning away from fossil fuels in terms of competing with the Russians. And I think people should read President Biden. This is what ultimately motivated him. Now, the second comment I wanted to make, I worked closely with three presidents. I was a political appointee for two Republican presidents, Reagan and the first Bush, two Democratic presidents, President Clinton and President Obama. Every president that I worked for, I would say two things. One, every campaign promise they made, they never forgot. And when they confronted something that put that campaign promise in a position where to sustain it would impose a great cost, it was like pulling teeth to get them to walk away from it. So every president confronts this. President Biden did as well, given his comments about Saudi Arabia. But every president also confronts something else. There's a constant effort to balance values and interests. Some presidents will lean more in the direction of interests. Some presidents will lean more in the direction of values. But I'll cite for you Jimmy Carter. Nobody would question whether Jimmy Carter made human rights a centerpiece of his foreign policy. But what was his approach to Saudi Arabia? Did he ever raise human rights with Saudi Arabia? No, his focus was oil. He was afraid there was going to be another oil embargo. And then after the Iran-Iraq war began, he went to great lengths to try to be responsive to the Saudis. He made a choice. Presidents are confronted constantly with dilemmas. Oftentimes, most of us who've been involved with policymaking will say, rarely do you have a choice that said, boy, here's my good choice, here's my bad choice. Usually your choice is bad to terrible. And you make those choices because you have the responsibility to do that.
I want to go to the listeners, or the watchers, I should say. We talked earlier about President Bush looking in Putin's eyes and seeing his soul. I don't know if Donald Trump saw his soul, but he looked in his eyes, that's for sure. EA wants to know, do you think Putin will continue to meddle in American politics?
Yes, because he sees a vulnerability, because he has the tools. And he believes that, through social media, through trolling, through the ability to create a viral effect of disinformation, he can play on the polarization that's here. So there's he will continue to do it. Again, understand who Putin is. He was trained as a KGB officer. His focus was on disinformation. So he now has a whole set of new tools that are dramatically more effective than anything he had before. And he can always deny it. And look, he always does deny it, but he will continue to do it. The only thing that would stop him is if he felt that we had the means to make life even more difficult for him using these same means. And to some extent, there are things that we can do. We can certainly expose all of his wealth. There are things we can do, and you have to decide, do you get into a kind of competition? Part of the problem is that they may be very vulnerable in terms of our ability to penetrate, cyber, in a cyber way, literally everything they have, all of their infrastructure. But they have demonstrated they can penetrate ours too. And so you end up having a kind of balance of terror. During the Cold War, we focused on the balance of terror, mutual assured destruction of both of us having nuclear weapons. In the cyber age, the problem is that there's also a kind of balance of terror. And so you take certain steps, you run the risk of what they can do to you.
RF wants to know about the report today that the United States is talking to Russia about trading a convicted arms merchant being held in this country for the basketball player Brittany Griner and one other person. Do you think that's going to happen?
I think there's a good possibility that could happen, yes. If we're offering the trade, this is someone that Putin has wanted for a long time.
Boot is his name.
Yeah, he's an arms dealer.
Yeah.
And they've wanted him. Look, it's very similar to what the Iranians do. The Iranians grab dual citizens and completely trumped up, and then hold them for people who have been arrested here. So Putin saw a kind of golden opportunity. And I think you understand the pressure that the Biden administration is under. And so these are really hard calls, again, because on the one hand, when you make these trades, you create additional incentives to grab people. On the other hand, when you don't make the trades, you look at someone like, who, Brittany, you look at, what she's going through, and this is someone, who is a victim of a much larger game that's being played.
Zidane wants to know, can and will the U.S. help Europeans this winter when Russian oil is cut back?
Well, I think we're clearly trying to do that. We are exporting more liquefied natural gas ourselves. We're seeing some of the Europeans are reaching out to different countries in the Middle East. There's an increasing effort to try to anticipate what Putin is going to do, and for us to try to create alternatives. We've been doing this for really, I would say, even before Putin went into Ukraine, because we believed we had the intelligence that he was going to. By the way, that intelligence proved to be right. The intelligence that proved to be wrong, we bought the idea that he would win very quickly.
Yeah.
That's why we offered to evacuate Zelensky.
Yeah.
Had our intelligence been as good on the weakness of the Russian military and the capabilities, the resilience and commitment and resolve of the Ukrainians, we could have been providing much more material much sooner, would have raised the cost of the Russians much more, and would have made the choices for Putin even harder.
How do you account for that big a mistake?
I think you have to think about how we get the intelligence. A lot of the intelligence is based on penetration of the Russians, which means we kind of listen to what they say to each other. So I think they expected they were going to be able to win very quickly. And I suspect that we were influenced by that. I mean, one of my professors at UCLA when I was at UCLA was Robert Jervis, who unfortunately recently passed away. And he talked a lot about how there are these kind of systems where we penetrate countries in an intelligence way. Some of the intelligence becomes very important in terms of understanding what they'll do, but oftentimes they end up influencing us in ways that we're not fully aware of. And I think that helps to explain what happened in this case.
I think you're answering a question. I just have to give credit to Sam for asking, what is your assessment of the impact of Biden's use of intelligence to preempt Russian actions against Ukraine? I think you've covered it.
Yeah, but I would say that I think we did it very well in terms of framing issues. I've written one book on statecraft, and I'm doing a new one on it. Good statecraft doesn't just involve all your tools. Good statecraft involves you frame the issue so the world responds to you. So others identify your objectives as being the right objectives. We frame the issues very well. We denied Putin the ability to frame this, which is what he would have done otherwise. So with that, we did very well. What we did less well was understand what the realities on the ground were going to look like.
A minute ago, you said something about Putin's money. I just have to ask you this. A couple of weeks ago, I talked with Bill Browder on this program. Bill Browder, former investor in Russia, now human rights advocate, I think, in behalf of the Magnitsky Act and so on. He told us, and he says in one of his books, he thinks that between Putin himself and other oligarchs, that the amount of money that has been stolen from Russia by those people may amount to $1 trillion. That's an order of magnitude just unspeakable. I can't get my mind around it.
Well, I have to admit, I can't either. I mean, it's.
You think it's true?
I suspect it's probably somewhat exaggerated, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was in, the hundreds of billions. I wouldn't be shocked by that. Again, think about Russia has these enormous natural resources. It's not just oil, it's gold, it's other minerals. I mean, they have enormous natural resources. They have an extractive economy, meaning they extract natural resources. They haven't developed the kind of data-based, big data, high-tech economy. And we're seeing, by the way, one of the problems they have, they have pretty much exhausted their precision guided missiles because they get the parts. A lot of the chips come from the outside.
Yeah.
And they can't fabricate them on their own. This too affects, I think, some of their capabilities.
Well, it's true of us as well when it comes to computer chips.
Yes, we depend heavily on Taiwan.
Yeah. I think you've touched on this, but Dan wants to know, what about the Western economic sanctions, and have they been effective? Can there be more done?
Clearly, more could be done, but there's obviously been a modulation here. Why? The Europeans, because of the heavy dependence on Russian energy, oil and natural gas, especially Germany, I think 60% of their natural gas was coming from Russia. So you can't go cold turkey on that. And creating alternatives, one of the things that I've always argued, this argument that we're energy independent, ignored the reality, there's one pool of energy worldwide. So when you take 20 or 30% out of that pool, you have just bid up the price of energy dramatically. It drives inflation, it increases the prospect of recession. We can't insulate ourselves from that. And so the Europeans actually, because so much of their natural gas and energy was coming from Russia, there are some alternatives, but it takes a long time to develop them. And the idea that they could simply cut the Russians off without creating an economic depression, that ultimately wasn't in our interest either, to put them in that position. So they're trying to be off of Russian energy by the end of the year. Now, what Putin is doing is he's trying to manipulate this in advance. So he's cutting dramatically the energy that's available now. And that is significant for a lot of reasons. But one of the things the Europeans were trying to do is they were trying to build stores of reserves in advance of the winter. This makes it harder to do it. So he's manipulating the supplies right now because he sees the benefit from his standpoint of increasing the pressures on them, putting them in a much worse position. Our ability to squeeze the Russians more is there, but we have a hard time doing it without also creating an economic set of consequences for ourselves and for others as well, especially the Europeans.
Jim wants to know this, and I think we've covered what the United States is doing in terms of help of supplying arms to Russia. He wants to know, to Ukraine, excuse me, should we risk a military confrontation with Russia in order to save Ukraine? I assume he means a direct attack.
So let me put this in some perspective. The answer, I agree with the president. The answer is no, even though I do think we could be providing more and we could run a bit more of a risk when it comes to what we provide, including the ranges of these systems. But for example, one of the things that Zelensky was calling for was a no-fly zone from the very beginning.
Yeah.
I understood why he was calling for it, but there was no way, the way we conduct a no-fly zone, our military has an approach, a strategy for how you impose no-fly. It's not just that you deal with the aircraft. We want to make sure that nothing can fly at all. For that to be the case, we have to take out all the surface-to-air missiles that the Russians have. Most of the surface-to-air missiles that the Russians have are based in Russia. So according to the way our military would operate, they would have to go take out the surface-to-air batteries that are in Russia. Well, the minute you do that, then you're in a shooting war with the Russians. President Biden was right. We should not be in a shooting war with the Russians. So you create that as the kind of upper limit of what you won't do. But within these boundaries, within the constraints, my feeling is we could probably do more than we're doing right now. Now there is, as I said earlier, part of the problem is our own stockpiles will begin to be drawn down to the point where the military will be uneasy. But that's why in the end, you're going to probably have to invest in replenishing everything that we're turning over to the Ukrainians. Anyway, I think the key point here is we can run, I think, a bit more risk than we have been running, but we're right not to get into a shooting war with the Russians.
We have the same question from Doug as we do from Barbara. And it is, how do you see this ending as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned?
Yeah, it's a great question. The only way I see it ending in a more favorable way is if we're able to raise, the Ukrainians are able to raise the price to the Russians to the point where Putin sees that he can't continue the war with costs being what they are. If the costs become too high in terms of personnel, he may decide he has to look for a way out. As a mediator, I can tell you, you look for moments to intervene when it's clear that both sides have an interest in having the conflict end. Today, neither side does. Putin because he thinks he can win a war of attrition, Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership because they think they can turn the tide and recover a territory that they've lost. If you're going to have this war end in a way that is sooner rather than later, both have to decide that the price is too high of going on. And then you look for, then you go for a negotiation. Now, the whole question of territory, what it's going to be, I mean, the Ukrainians want to recover everything. They don't want to recognize Crimea. If they can turn the tide in a way that makes that possible, it's one thing. If they can't turn the tide in a way that makes that possible, then you think about an outcome that is less than that. And we froze over $300 billion of Russian reserves. Putin clearly will try to use leverage as in concluding the conflict to recover all or part of that. We will want to use as much of it for reconstruction of Ukraine as we can. That will be bound up in a negotiation, but it all comes back to what I was saying. Until each side feels that the price is too high for going on, this war will not end.
We got 3 minutes to go. I've asked a lot of questions. Our listeners have asked a lot of questions. Take it away. What would you like to say in passing, if you will, or in closing, that we haven't heard yet?
I wanted, you asked me about the criticism of Biden as it relates to Saudi Arabia, and I want to say something about Saudi Arabia. Obviously, the killing of Khashoggi was morally reprehensible and colossally stupid, because you kill someone who's identified with the Washington Post, a leading shaper of how the media approaches issues. That issue has drowned out what is happening, blinded everyone and the coverage to what is happening in Saudi Arabia in terms of a transformation from a state that was guided by Wahhabi ideology, which is the source of Al-Qaeda, the source of ISIS. That's where the ideology came from. Saudi Arabia today is a completely different country.
And you've been there.
Where modernization and nationalism is now the source of legitimacy, not Wahhabism. The religious clerics have been completely, they've lost their power. They used to control education. They used to export madrasas worldwide. All that's gone. Now it's happened because the Saudi leadership, the crown prince, understood for Saudi Arabia to succeed, it had to modernize. And it could only modernize if it didn't exclude half its population, meaning women. They had to be integrated into the country in a way that was impossible so long as Wahhabism guided everything. Today, all the guidance laws, that prevented women from couldn't travel without a male companion, couldn't be out there on their own without a male guidance, couldn't open a business without male guidance, couldn't get a loan, couldn't do divorce. All those are gone. You go to Saudi Arabia today and you see a social liberalization. It's important. I think it was important for Biden to go to establish some limits in terms of, look, we're not going to walk away from human rights. And if you do things across the line, we're going to call you on it. But we also have these interests I talked about earlier as it relates to transition away from fossil fuels. And we also have an interest in the success of their social transformation, their national transformation domestically. If they can create a successful model of development, which the Arab world has never had, which is why you had radical nationalists before, why you have radical fundamentalist Islamists, like Al-Qaeda and ISIS now. Having a successful model of development is something that the Middle East and the Arab world has always needed. If this can become that, that serves our interest not only in the region, but beyond.
Ambassador Dennis Ross, you have shed a lot of light tonight, and we much appreciate your being with us. And thank you so very, very much. Great to talk with you.
Always good to talk with you, Warren. Thank you.
Next week, it's going to be Michigan's State Senator Gary Peters, who's chair of the Senate's Homeland Security Committee. He's going to be engaged in a discussion on domestic extremism with the Pulitzer Prize-winning Los Angeles Times columnist and a friend of mine, Pat Morrison. That's going to be next Wednesday, August 3rd at 5 o'clock. So thank you all very much for joining us. Have good health and stay safe.